Meu salário não é muito não, viu, José?
You probably know him as the father of the poor, the worker who became president, or, as Obama once said, the most popular politician on earth. But today, Lula's image isn't just questioned by his critics. Even many of his former supporters are having second thoughts. Corruption scandals, jailed allies, disappointing successors, and a lackluster comeback. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has a roller coaster of a story. A roller coaster full of triumphs and setbacks. From the presidency to prison and back again. Few figures have shaped Brazil as deeply as he has. To make sense of Brazil today, first, you need to understand the key players. And there's no better place to start than the man who's already been president 3 times in the past 25 years. And who just might be aiming for a 4th. Hello everyone and welcome to the Hemisphere. It's a pleasure to have you back. The year is 1980. Following the release of its letters of principles the year before, Brazil's Workers' Party is officially born. Right in the middle of a military dictatorship and at the tail end of the Soviet Union. The party's foundations stands on 3 main pillars. Christians inspired by the liberation theology, former guerrilla fighters seeking to turn the resistance into an institutional change, industrial workers and union leaders from the ABC Paulista, a cluster of cities in São Paulo's industrial heartland. It's from their very region that Lula's journey history begins. In the 1970s, he rose to leadership positions, leading massive union strikes. In 1978 and 1980, he led 170,000 metal workers in strikes that virtually shut down the Brazilian auto industry hub, despite the military regime's ban on such strikes. These actions turned Lula into a folk hero for the working class, and a thorn in the side of the ruling military, which led him to being arrested under the national security law. As Brazil transitioned back to democracy in the mid-1980s, Lula became a key player in the movement to restore direct elections, the Diretas Já campaign of 1984. And 2 years later, won a seat in the Congress as the most voted federal deputy from São Paulo, entering the Constituent Assembly that drafted Brazil's 1988 democratic constitution. Despite claiming today that he and the Workers' Party support the constitution, they voted against the approval. Lula first ran for president in 1989, Brazil's first direct presidential election after 21 years of military rule. Lula's early campaigns embraced bold radical proposals, calling for land reforms, a suspension of foreign debt payments, and the collectivization of the means of production. Despite gaining support from workers, artists, and a significant part of the media, he narrowly lost the 1989 runoff to Fernando Collor de Mello. A major factor in his defeat was a fear campaign portraying him as a dangerous leftist. Still determined, Lula ran against in 1994 and 1998, but lost both times to Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the center-right candidate who stabilized Brazil's economy by introducing the real, the country's currency still used today. It wasn't until 2002 that Lula finally won, but the path to victory came with a deep compromise to the Workers' Party's original ideas. Between 1989 and 2002, Lula and the Workers' Party demanded the impeachment of every president, opposed the Real Plan, and promoted socialist policy, all while championing honesty and anti-corruption values. However, after each defeat, they gradually softened their platform, forming broader alliances and embracing political strategies they once had condemned. To signal the shift, Lula chose businessman José Alencar as his running mate and released an open letter promising to uphold fiscal responsibility. This move was designed to calm middle-class voters, reassure investors, and gain the trust of banks and the economical elites. A clear departure from his earlier rhetoric. At last, in October 2002, Lula's persistence paid off. On his fourth attempt, he was elected president of Brazil, winning the runoff with over 53 million voters at the age of 57. A former factory worker and union leader, and the first Brazilian president without a university degree. He had just reached the nation's highest office. But the rose-colored glasses many wore during his campaign didn't last. Over the course of his presidency, the shine began to fade, and the cracks in the idealized image of Lula started to show. Lula's two presidential terms, 2003 and 2010, coincided with global commodity boom driven by China. A stroke of luck that helped Brazil fuel its economic rise. Backed by a broad political coalition, he combined pragmatic economical policies with ambitious social programs that reshaped the country. To the surprise of many critics, Lula maintained a low inflation and controlled public debt, while capitalizing on soaring demands for Brazilian exports. At the same time, his administration made a major investment in social welfare. Programs like Fome Zero, Zero Hunger, and Bolsa Família, a conditional cash transfer program for low-income families, lifted millions out of extreme poverty. The minimum wage rose by over 50% in real terms, and Brazil experienced an employment surge during this presidency. Under Lula, the economy boomed, GDP growth was strong, foreign reserves grew, and in 2008, Brazil achieved investment grade status. His unique blend of economic orthodoxy and social inclusion won widespread support. By the time Lula left office in 2011, his approval ratings were sky high, between 80% and 87%, the highest ever for a Brazilian president. Brazil had briefly become the sixth largest economy in the world and had earned the right to host both the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Olympics, global symbols of its newfound status. But Lula's economic success is often seen today as a chicken flying, crazy and hopeful, but in the end, it could never reach the sky. While there were undeniable improvements in the lives of Brazilians' poor population, much of the programs was the result of a groundwork laid by his predecessors. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Lula's two flagship programs, Bolsa Família and Fome Zero, were essentially expansions of the social initiatives launched under Cardoso. The same president who tamed Brazil's rampant inflation and opened its markets to the world. The economic boom under Lula was less about Brazil's inherent strength and more about China's insatiable demand for commodities, a sector that had long been Brazil's strong suit. Despite the Workers' Party's frequent clashes with agribusiness. Yet, despite this favorable economic climate and unprecedented cash flow, Lula's government failed to tackle Brazil's deep structural issues. Instead of investing in a long-term productivity or strengthening the country's industrial base, it prioritized in short-term spending and politically motivated investment. As a result, Brazil managed to leap forward during those years, but never truly taken flight. Lula's tenure was tarnished by major corruption scandals that shook Brazilian politics and undermined its democracy. The first one was the Mensalão scandal, a congressional vote buying scheme that exploded in 2005 during Lula's first term. Mensalão, Portuguese for big monthly payment, the Mensalão scandal exposed a massive voter buying scheme in which public funds were shipping off to pay off members of Congress in exchange for political support. Dozens of high-profile figures were implicated, including Lula's powerful chief of staff, José Dirceu. Though Lula himself was never formally charged, he claimed to have no knowledge of the scheme but publicly apologized, saying that he felt betrayed by his own party. The scandal delivered a serious blow to Lula's image. Still, he managed to survive politically by firing those involved and distancing himself from the fallout. Incredibly, he went on to win a re-election in 2006. Whenever due to complacency or ignorance, his popularity remained largely intact. Yet, the Mensalão case was more than just a corruption scandal. It was a direct attack on Brazil's democratic institutions, revealing how power could be secured not through negotiation or policy, but throughout payouts. The image of Lula as a brilliant political strategist began to crack. After all, it's easy to win over Congress when you're paying them. After Lula's second term, his chosen successor, Dilma Rousseff, a former energy minister and Lula's chief of staff, was elected president in 2010, promising to carry on his legacy, but her presidency soon ran into stormy waters, largely due to unsustainable government spending and excessive focus on consumption over saving. Then the bombshell came. In 2014, Operation Car Wash, or Operação Lava Jato, uncovered the largest corruption scandal in Brazilian history, a sprawling scheme dubbed Petrolão, or Big Oil, involving the state's oil giant Petrobras. Investigators revealed that, starting in the year 2000, Petrobras executives colluded with major construction firms to inflate contracts and divert billions of reais to politicians and parties, including Lula's PT and its allies, and even opposition figures in exchange for lucrative deals. The scheme skimmed off as much as 3% from Petrobras contracts and used to slush funds to line the pockets of corrupt officials and finance election campaigns, including President Dilma election. That scandal struck a nerve. Petrobras had long been a symbol of national pride, and its fall from grace shook the country. Although Dilma Rousseff was not personally accused of profiting from the scheme, her credibility was deeply damaged. The combination of public outrage over rampant corruption and a severe economic recession in 2015 plunged her government into crisis. Ultimately, it led to her impeachment in 2016, marking a dramatic turning point in Brazil's political landscape. Even as Operation Car Wash brought down Dilma Rousseff's presidency, investigators were zeroing in on Lula. In March 2016, his home was raided and he was briefly detained for questioning. Soon after, prosecutors charged him with bribery and money laundering, alleging that Lula secretly owned a luxurious countryside farmhouse and a 3-story beachfront apartment, both renovated by the construction firm OAS, as kickbacks from securing Petrobras contracts. Lula firmly denied the accusations, insisting he never owned the apartments and that no official documents proved otherwise. But the case snowballed. In a desperate and controversial move, President Rousseff attempted to appoint Lula as her chief of staff in 2016, a position that would have granted him ministerial immunity from persecution. A judge blocked the appointment, and a leaked wiretap of a phone call between Rousseff and Lula, interpreted by many as an attempt to shield him, further outraged the public.
Alô?
Alô?
Lula, deixa eu te falar uma coisa. Seguinte, eu tô mandando o Bessia junto com o papel pra gente ter ele e só usa em caso de necessidade, que é o termo de posse. Tá?
Ah, tá bom.
Só isso, você espera aí que ele tá indo aí.
Tá bom, tô aqui, fica aguardando.
Tá?
Tá bom.
Tchau.
Tchau, querida.
Lula's case quickly became the centerpiece of Operation Car Wash. In July 2017, he was convicted by Judge Sergio Moro, the figurehead of the anti-corruption crusade, for accepting bribes, laundering money, and concealing assets. He was sentenced to 9.5 years in prison. Lula appealed, but in January 2018, an appellate court unanimously upheld the conviction and even extended his sentence to 12 years. Despite the mounting legal defeats, Lula maintained his innocence, claiming he was the victim of a political witch hunt. In his view, The courts were being used to do what his opponents could never achieve at the ballot box. After exhausting his initial appeals, Lula surrendered to the federal police in April 2018. In an emotional scene, he addressed a crowd of supporters before taken into custody. A dramatic fall for Brazil's most iconic political figure. Lula's fortunes took a dramatic turn in late 2019. That November, Brazil's Supreme Federal Court ruled that the defendants could only be imprisoned after all appeals were exhausted, overturning the rule that had landed Lula behind bars after his first conviction was upheld. The decision led to his release after 19 months in prison. But the twist didn't end there. In 2019 and 2020, The Intercept Brazil published explosive leaks suggesting that Judge Sergio Moro and federal prosecutors had colluded to convict Lula, furthering strengthening claims that he had been denied a fair trial. Then, in March 2021, the tide fully turned. Brazil's Supreme Court annulled all of Lula's convictions, stating that the Curitiba court lacked proper jurisdiction. In a separate 7-4 decision, which notably included a favorable vote from a judge appointed by Jair Bolsonaro, the court ruled that the Judge Moro had been biased and did not conduct a fair trial. With these rulings, Lula's criminal record was wiped clean and his political rights fully restored, clearing the way for him to run for office once again. His critics insisted he wasn't innocent, he was merely unguilty, but legally, Lula was not only absolved, he was now officially considered a victim of judicial misconduct. For Lula and his supporters, this wasn't just a legal victory, it was a vindication, a long-awaited confirmation that the charges had been politically motivated from the start. With his political rights restored, Lula mounted a dramatic comeback. He set his sights on defeating President Jair Bolsonaro by building a wide-reaching coalition from leftist social movements to centrist leaders. In a symbolic move, he chose former rival Geraldo Alckmin, a moderate, as his vice president running mate, signaling a shift towards the political center. Lula's campaign centered on 3 main promises: defending democracy, rebuilding the country, and caring for the poor. He capitalized on the public anger over Bolsonaro's chaotic handling of COVID-19's pandemic, which claimed over 700,000 lives, and growing concerns about Bolsonaro's authoritarian rhetoric and attacks on democratic institutions. Still, despite Bolsonaro's unpopularity, the race was tight. In an intense polarized runoff in October 2022, Lula won by just 1.8%, the narrowest margin in Brazil's democratic history. While effective in mobilizing voters against Bolsonaro, Lula's campaign offered little beyond nostalgia. He ran without a clear government plan, relying instead on the emotional weight of his past leadership and memory of better days. It was a victory driven more by rejection of Bolsonaro than by a clear vision of the future. On January 1st, 2023, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was sworn in as president of Brazil for the 3rd time at the age of 77. Making history as the oldest person to assume the office and the first to serve on a non-consecutive presidential terms. Lula's 3rd term has been marked by controversy both at home and abroad. Domestically, his broad coalition, essential to his return, has remained fractured, often leaving him frustrated in his own efforts to pass legislation. Economically, His most notable measures so far have been tax hikes that appear to disproportionately impact the lower and middle class. Internationally, Lula has spent over 120 days abroad since taking office in January 2023, reportedly to strengthen diplomatic ties. Yet, critics argue that many of the trips served little strategic purpose and instead reflected the perks of the office. Extravagant travels often shared with his new wife, drawing public scrutiny. To some observers, this term has revealed a sobering reality. Lula's renowned political instincts and connections to the people may have been uniquely suited to the favorable conditions of the early 2000s. Conditions that no longer exist. In today's more complex and polarized world, these same instincts appear less effective. On the global stage, Lula's influence has undeniably shifted. While once celebrated internationally, his image has been clouded by past corruption scandals, memories that have faded from the minds of the world leaders. Compounding this is the changing geopolitical landscape with the rise of right-leaning governments worldwide, reducing his diplomatic traction. During this term, Lula has taken bold and controversial foreign policy stances, drawing false equivalences between Russia and Ukraine, and positioning himself as a vocal ally of China within BRICS. These moves have strained Brazil's ties with the United States and other Western nations, contributing to the current tariff war with the US. Check out our video for more on that. As for what comes next, Brazil's future remains as uncertain as ever. Will Lula have the will, popularity, or even the health to run for a fourth term in 2026? If not, who will carry his torch? Will his old rival, Bolsonaro, be allowed to return and reclaim the throne? Or will he meet the same fate Lula had years ago in prison? Whatever happens, one thing is clear. Lula da Silva is and will remain one of the most influential figures in Brazilian history. Love him or hate him, his legacy, for better or worse, will long outlive his time in office. Thank you very much for watching the Hemisphere. It's a pleasure of having you here. Thank you very much for 1K followers on YouTube and 3K followers on Instagram. You guys are amazing. Please consider sharing and subscribing for more content. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.